This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, this is Frank Niepold over at NOAA. I'm your facilitator today, and welcome to the Clean Weekly Telecon for February 19th, 2019. It strikes me that we've been doing this for like over 10 years on Tuesdays at 1 o'clock, which is pretty stunning. But today we have the opportunity to hear from Mark McCaffrey, who was one of the founding members of the Clean Network. So it's coming full circle in some interesting ways. So hopefully those who've joined us today, we can get into it. So it's great that you're with us, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.
But as we usually start, we have announcements for the good of the group and the network. So let's open it up. Do we have any announcements that people want to share before we get into our time with Mark? Are we being shy today?
This is Katie Boyd. I just I sent an email last week to the Clean Network, and I'll probably send another one next week as well. But we have our webinar series starting up next week for teachers who are interested in learning about how to use Clean, and especially how to use it to address NGSS. And we have a new webinar that's really focused on the human impacts of climate change. So anyways, if you know of teachers who might be interested, let them know. And yeah, I'll send an email out to the group again next week. And you can look for mine from last week for the details of how to register for that.
Thank you, Katie. Others?
Yeah, hi, this is Jen Kretzer. Hi, everybody from the Wild Center. I wanted to mention that we have another Youth Climate Summit coming up. This one is being organized by one of our alumni who's now a sophomore in engineering at Columbia University. It'll be on March 8th, Friday, March 8th, all day, and open to high school students, in the New York City, New Jersey area. And I'll put an announcement out on the Clean Network today.
Thank you, Jen.
Sure.
While we're there, I did want to point out that the Climate Program Office at NOAA and Will Steger and others have been partnering together to support Washington State in their climate change and NGSS professional development. I just put the link to that, and the third of that series is going to be coming up on Monday, the 25th at 1 o'clock Pacific time. And so somebody, Mike Chang from the National Climate Assessment, who focused on the Northwest chapter, is going to be with us, as is Cheryl Manning, who a lot of you in the community know, will be also joining on how to use that science in an educational context. So that's coming up again on the 25th. So promote that with your networks and participate. And the other thing is, the nice thing is, the way Climate Generation puts webinars that have been recorded, like the one that came from the 28th, are it's very easy to access. It's all built into the web browser because of Zoom. So anyway, just you might find those recorded ones. And while most of the people attending these are people from Washington State, that is not unique value for them. So others may find these generally valuable for other networks or themselves. Just wanted to point that out to you guys. So other announcements. Anything else out there? All right.
This is Tamara. I was at the AAAS meeting, and just one interesting bit of information. The AAAS has sections, and there's a section on geology and geography that has been in the last year wanting to change its name to geosciences, and then there's an atmospheric and hydrospheric section. And the interesting piece in our context is that they're talking about potentially merging and bringing the words environment and sustainability potentially into that context. So a bit of updating of the focus of some of the sections at AAAS that are relevant to the issues that we deal with today.
Great. Tamara, did you go to the Family Day event?
No, I wasn't there.
Okay.
Tamara, congratulations. I heard you're a fellow now.
Yes, I am officially a AAAS fellow.
That's
Thanks.
exciting.
Yes.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And for those of you who don't know, Tamara was another of the founding members of the Clean Network. I believe we were sitting in a Quiznos.
Yes, we were. Yeah, with one of our partners on the phone while we passed the cell phone around so she could hear the conversation.
Yeah. So, all right. Last chance before we jump in. Mark, usually you have so much to give us, and there's so much to say, and I see you've got a good group of people here, but I'm going to give one more chance for any other announcements. If not, we can always do it at the end. If that makes sense. All right. Let's move on.
Sorry, this is Anna. I joined just a bit late. Katie, did you talk about the clean webinars?
She did?
Yeah, I did.
Perfect. So if anyone has networks where you can promote those, that would be great.
Katie, would you mind putting the link to those from the Clean website in the chat window just so people can grab it and go?
Yep, I'll do that right now.
Fantastic. Thank you. So, Mark, you ready?
Yes, indeed.
All right. So happy to have Mark McCaffrey join us today, exploring this scaling sustainable practices. Really critically important point, both domestically and internationally, on the work that we do. So, Mark, I don't want to spend a lot of time here because you've got so much to give us. So, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Frank.
Of course.
Just before I get too far into this, is the sound okay?
Yes, I can hear you just fine, Mark.
All right. Very good. All right. So I think I know a lot of you, but right now, I'm not sure if all of you are aware that I am now working to start a new organization called ECOS, the Education, Communication, and Outreach Stakeholders Community, which is officially a part of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I'll talk a little bit about the origins of that in a minute. But I am actually located in Budapest, Hungary most of the time, although right now I'm about an hour east and north of Budapest in a little village called Kispagyon, where my wife and I moved about 4 years ago after living for 4 or 5 years in the Bay Area. So until last December, I was a senior research fellow with the Institute for Sustainable Development at the National University for Public Service. And also,
Oh,
okay.
Maybe a lot of us could be on the phone, could mute just to make sure we're not the cause of it. And hopefully, Mark, this is not an international issue, but let's see if that works.
Okay. Yeah, if it's me causing the feedback, I'm not sure what to do.
You just keep on going. We'll just, we'll work through it.
Okay, very good. So how many of you remember where you were November 9th, 2016? Of course, that was the day after the US presidential election. I happened to be in Maribor, Slovenia, and that's a relatively small city. It's about 100,000 people. So it's the size of Boulder, Colorado, or Las Cruces, New Mexico. And I was there because I was doing some consulting work with Climate Kick. Climate Kick is, KIC stands for Knowledge Innovation Community. It's funded by the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, which is based in Budapest, but they fund projects like Climate Kick. There's an Energy Kick. There's now, I think, 6 or 7 different kicks out there. But Climate Kick is the largest. It's the largest public-private partnership around climate in Europe, and the European Institute of Innovation and Technology funds it to the tune of 90 to 100 million euros a year. So it's very well funded. And most of that money actually goes into seed projects. And so the project in Maribor, Slovenia that I was evaluating was funded through this Climathon seed project, where they basically gave a team of people money to help facilitate community engagement and developing kind of brainstorming over a very intense 24-hour period, possible climate interventions. And the day I was there, November 9th, I had spent the morning actually on Skype helping launch ECOS, this new education, communication, and outreach stakeholder community at the COP22 in Marrakesh. So I was in Maribor, but participating remotely in the launch of ECOS. We called it eCongo at the time. So in the morning, I helped launch ECOS, and then in the rest of the day, I was learning about this project in Maribor, Slovenia, that was funded through this Climate Kick seed project. And basically, they spent a 24-hour intensive period late into the evening, and then they got up again early in the morning and did some yoga and finalized their plans around what they could do to engage the community around climate action. And what they came up with was the idea of a neighborhood center that could be an education learning center, but it could also serve practical needs. The idea was that it would be kind of a permaculture garden to demonstrate sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture techniques. But it could also serve as a place where people could come and share ideas, get food from the garden and so forth. It was going to be located near a school. And the day I was there, they were actually presenting this idea to the mayor of the city, who was very supportive. And they were then, after I left, I heard that they worked with the mayor to put together some grant proposals. So I was really quite impressed by this community-based approach to climate interventions. And again, it's a good example of how small seed grants can really go a long way to helping get. So anyhow, fast forward. In early December, I don't know what that's, not sure what the problem is here. Early December, there was the AGU, which I also participated in remotely. And I don't know if any of you heard the talk of Jane Long at the Fall AGU in San Francisco, but she presented this slide that I'm showing here that suggested that between an individual and the global scale, there might be a sweet spot where the ability to act, which is high for individuals, at least in theory, because individuals have agency to act, and the global impact, which we're looking for around climate action, somewhere in between, there's a regional sweet spot she proposed. And so I was wondering in my own mind where that regional sweet spot might be. And in mid-December of that same year, I went to Stockholm to a workshop on social tipping points of decarbonization that the Stockholm Resilience Center had organized. And in my mind, education and engagement could be a really important social tipping point. And the question was, in my mind, where is this sweet spot where we can maximize impact and ability, the ability to act with the impact. So as we had our discussions at the social tipping point, I was frustrated by the fact that we kept talking about scale in very vague terms. So I was proposing that maybe we could have this idea of intervention learning centers, community hubs, as a way that we could help inform and engage communities around demonstrating clean energy systems and accelerating social transformation. Let me just stop for a second and see if the sound is really excruciating to people.
It's a little rough. I'm wondering if you might be able to switch to phone audio, if that's an option. I don't know if you've got that capability in Hungary there.
Probably not. I would assume. Mark, you know, one other option is that if you just drop off and drop back on, we can, if you leave it, that may be your better option. I don't think calling back in is going to work.
Well, there seems to be some feedback with the headset that I have here.
Can you take off the headset?
Well, let me take off the speaker and I'll just talk.
Yeah, there you go.
No, that's not going to work either. Hold on here.
What you, I mean, just while you're doing that, Mark, I mean, what you're talking about is really, really important. And so, you know, as one of our key thought leaders, let's just make it work. And for those of you who are listening to this recording, bear with us. We were working through this, but Mark has always been a very forward-thinking thought leader in our community. So it bears waiting for this to get worked out. So Mark, you think you're ready?
Okay. Yeah, so I turned down the speakers and hopefully that'll make a difference.
Perfect.
Does that sound better?
So far.
All right, so at the workshop at the Stockholm Resilience Center, I proposed the idea of kind of a thought experiment of looking back from the year 2050 at how we were able to successfully tackle climate change. And I suggested that a turning point was around the year 2016, when this article was published in the journal Science, pointing out the fact that while teachers were teaching, like in the United States, about climate change, they were not teaching it in a very deep way. Also, around the same time, there was an article in Nature Climate Change pointing out the fact that education was important to helping people develop climate concern and be willing to take action. Obviously, you can't really take informed action if you don't understand the basic dynamics of climate change. And the Nature Climate Change paper also pointed out that improving basic education, climate literacy, and public understanding of the local dimensions of climate change are vital for public engagement. So we can also point to education facilities around the world, like Casey Middle School in Boulder, Colorado. But of course, not every school has, the ability to raise $31 million for a school that's essentially like a living laboratory. So what some innovators concluded was they could develop smaller scale learning centers and community hubs that would be for maybe smaller sized communities. And they called these ideas back in 2016, 2017, the Hive, with the idea that these would be customized for the local needs, but they would basically have some similar components, little modules, perhaps modified shipping containers with solar panels and ways to store that energy. There was actually something called the integrated water technology, water aid technology developed in Hungary, where they were using this type of system to supply clean water to villages. And they were able to use super efficient solar PV to generate the energy to purify the water. And of course, this is a system that could be easily deployed pretty much anywhere in the world. So this model of the Hive helped to motivate people to develop these all over the world back around the year 2020. And they used state-of-the-art energy storage and were able to be customized for a community, whether they needed medical supplies, fresh water, access to the internet. And it was funded by having about 10 million of these around the world, each funded at the cost of about $500,000 USD, which cost a total of $5 trillion back in the year 2020 or thereabouts. And you might ask, where did that $5 trillion come from? Well, it came from taxing the wealthy, of course. But in any event, this was an approach that proved to be quite successful. And so in the long term, it's been self-sustaining. So anyhow, that's the thought experiment that I presented at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And of course, it also tied in with some of the original vision of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Article 6 specifically focused on providing education and public access to information, public awareness, public participation to develop adequate responses to climate change, training, and international collaboration and cooperation. By the way, this Article 6 of the convention was rebranded as Action for Climate Empowerment in the year 2015. It also ties in with Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, and that's all about community capacity building. So where is the sweet spot where hives and other climate action interventions could be most appropriate? One of the things that came out of that Stockholm Resilience Center workshop was the idea that we could apply the powers of 10 to the scales between an individual and the global scale of, roughly 10 million people. We're not quite to 10 million yet, but we're heading that direction. And by the year 2050, we'll be very close to that point, if not over. So as it turns out, there happen to be 10 orders of magnitude between an individual and the global scale. There are other cross-scale frameworks that this powers of 10 approach can really complement. For instance, Wilson in 2012 came up with the spatial scales of resilience, global, national, regional, local, community, and household level. So I think the powers of 10 adds some nuance and precision to that scale. There's also work that's gone into cross-scale frameworks around management, institutions, jurisdictions, governance, and so forth, that again can tie in with this framework. So out of that Stockholm Resilience workshop that I attended, I met a man named Avit Bomick, who was a postdoc there working with Future Earth and the Climate Resilience Center. And we started to work together on the powers of 10 framework using those 10 orders of magnitude. And one of the things that we really wanted to try to point to was the fact that even though a lot of climate policies are focused on nations and nationally determined contributions and so forth, the fact of the matter is nations vary in scale over 4 orders of magnitude. And the US is the 3rd largest nation in the world, but it's a 1/3 the size of India or China. The average size nation actually turns out to be the size of Iraq or Poland at about 38 million. But the median size is 8.8 million. In other words, half the countries in the world are 8.8 million or smaller. And the thing is that there's also 40 megacities over 10 million, and the combined total of those megacities is more than double the bottom half of the countries of the world. So we also run into this relativity of terms when we're talking about not just cities, but regions. And, we often think of regions like in the United States, the National Climate Assessment breaks off their climate assessments into different regions of the country, which, makes good sense. But some of those regions have, tens of millions of people, and some have, much smaller populations. Also, especially when we're talking about regional governance, some regional governments are tiny, maybe a few thousand or tens of thousands of people, and some can be millions of people. So for instance, there's a regional government in Finland, in some of the islands, in the archipelago there, that are only a few thousand people. And there's also a similar sized regional government in the Basque country of Spain that's several million people. And then finally, the term community can be very confusing because we often refer to community without being specific about how many people we're really talking about. So hopefully the powers of 10 approach, which we use in science and mathematics all the time, can really be beneficial in providing some precision to this. We have proposed in our paper a taxonomy that, again, uses terms that often are used in very vaguely defined ways, but hopefully this approach can provide a bit more precision. So I'm just going to quickly walk through them. The individual would be 1 to the 0, or 10 to the 0 power, which is where each of us as individuals stand. Families are somewhere between 1 and 10 people generally. A few families are bigger, but most are not. And then we can move into personal networks of 100 or thereabouts. There's an interesting anthropologist and primate expert named Robin who's studied personal networks in a lot of depth, not only among humans, but among other primates. And there's the so-called Dunbar number of 140 something, which is basically the size of most people's and most primates' large social networks, personal networks. Beyond that, we can move into neighborhood scale, the village scale, 10,000 people or so. What we're now calling the meta community scale of 100,000 people. So a city like Boulder or Las Cruces, or a district of Budapest like Józsefváros district, which is around 100,000 people. And at 100,000, it's really, we can say that it's a scale where the local and the global converge. You can pack 100,000 people into a big soccer or football stadium. And beyond that, up into the million scale, we call that the urban scale, the national state scale, nation state scale, 10 to the 7th power. We're now calling this the subcontinental scale at 10 to the 8th, and then the continental scale at 10 to the 9th, like a billion people in Europe, a billion people in the Americas, etc. And then finally, all 7.5 billion of us right now that inhabit planet Earth. So a couple more points to this powers of 10 approach. We do know from analysis of transformation in some of the literature that theoretically every individual can transform the world, although in reality people's agency varies a lot depending on the culture and their economic situation. Clearly some people more than others, if they have political clout and status, and there's obviously big gender issues involved with this as well, have a greater ability to make a mark on the world than others. But ultimately, if we're talking about global transformation, it means that people's behaviors and lifestyles, as well as infrastructures, need to be transformed. So again, this Powers of 10 framework helps us to think about the common but differentiated responsibilities. This is a term that the UNFCCC uses, common but differentiated responsibilities for nations. But I think we could say the same for scales of society, that, as individuals and couples and families, personal networks, we have different responsibilities and abilities than do the communities and countries and networks that we are a part of, that we're nested within. So our theory as we entered into our research was that there is a sweet spot around the scale of this meta community scale of about 100,000 people. And again, where the local and the global converge. And one of the ways that we decided we would test out this theory was to take some actual data sets and analyze where different climate actions would fit into the scheme by looking at the range that each of these actions could be deployed at, where the agency and impact would be optimized. And the co-authors on this paper that we have in review in the journal Science right now, in addition to myself and Abbott, Abby Ruskey, who I think is on the call, who's in Washington State, along with Chad Frischman from Project Drawdown, and Owen Gaffney, who's been with the Stockholm Resilience Center and Future Earth, and is now moving with Johan Rockström to the Potsdam Institute in Germany. So the five of us basically took data. We took the Powers of 10 framework, and which helps us frame these different systems and structures, institutions, and so forth, and how they fit into this Powers of 10 approach. And we borrowed some of Chad's data from Project Drawdown, and I think most of you are familiar with Drawdown, but it's basically, very briefly, the first time anybody has actually sat down and looked at more or less 100 different strategies for reducing carbon emissions or sequestering carbon, and then dug into the literature and done modeling around all those different approaches. So Drawdown is defined as that point in time when the concentration of greenhouse gases peak and begin to decline on a year-to-year basis, when basically natural processes can begin to pull that greenhouse gas concentration out of the atmosphere and store it again in the natural system. We looked at 72 of the Drawdown solutions. They looked at 100 different strategies, and we combined a couple and ignored a couple for a couple of different reasons. But with 72 different strategies, we had a lot of data to work with. And essentially what we did was we took each one of the 72 and looked at the range for likely implementation where there's agency and impact. I mean, ultimately the impact is global, but for practical purposes, we were looking at where these different strategies could be deployed on a practical level. And we defined our concept of agency as the critical mass for decision making and implementation, the number of people who benefit or lose firsthand. So there's really three different types of agencies. The agency that the research community focuses on, the agency of an individual, proxy agency of someone making decisions for other people, and then ultimately collective agency. where people have built up enough of a collective momentum, so to speak, that they can help deploy and implement different strategies. So I think that gives you a little bit of an overview. And one of the things about Drawdown that you're probably aware of is that they also focus a lot on social solutions like educating girls. So it's not just the technical approaches like the traditional renewable energy strategies, but for those of you not familiar with Drawdown, I would encourage you to take a close look at their website and drill down into the data and the background information at drawdown.org. So what we found is that there indeed is a sweet spot, but it's lower than we had anticipated. It's actually more at the 10,000 people scale rather than the maybe more 10,000 people for optimizing the impact. And at that scale, what we call the P4 scale, there's almost 180 gigatons of carbon that could be reduced from the year 2020 to 2050 against a baseline sort of business as usual type of scenario. And again, our paper that's in review explains the methodology and the details of how we arrived at these numbers. Drawdown had 3 different scenarios. We used the most conservative of the 3, which is still going to be tough to attain, but it's called the plausible scenario because it's within the realm of doability. The other 2 scenarios, one's called drawdown, and the final one is called optimal. We tied in our research to how this might dovetail with geospatial analysis, and in our view, we can talk about the local scale on up to the P6 level, which would be 1 million people, and then regional would be 1 million to 100 million people. No, up to 1 billion people. So regional would be up to the continental scale, and then global being the ultimate of everybody on the planet. And finally, we also tied in with the transformation spheres developed by Karen O'Neill and her colleagues up in Norway, with the personal sphere being really that personal network that Robin Dunbar and others have explored, and the political sphere being between there and the global scale. So again, to summarize, we're focused on that optimized scaling for climate action, where we can really maximize our efforts. We, just like with the drawdown strategies, we can't look for any one approach because we need all of them to be working together very closely. And the same with the scales. We can't just expect for the national scale to solve all our problems. We need to be working at the personal network scale in our households, in our communities, in our countries, and on up. But these things all do nest together. And if we focus, I think, more of our attention on this P4, P5 scale, I think we can really maximize our efforts aligned with the larger scales and as well as getting amplification through the individual and neighborhood scales. So one of the surprises of Drawdown's analysis is that the food sector actually turns out to be maybe the biggest. Again, I can't I can't stress this enough that we need all of these approaches. We can't just depend on dealing with energy and land use. We need food, women and girls, and transportation, materials, etc. All right, so just to kind of wrap up here, I think this gives you an overview of some of what we touched on in our research. We live clearly in a very hyper-connected world, and there's connections between all of these scales. I think there's also a lot of potential for this powers of 10 approach to help us look at the sustainable development goals and how they can be deployed. You know, again, the nations of the world, just like with the UNFCCC, the nations of the world have agreed in principle to deploying the SDGs, but it's one thing to promise that we're going to attain these goals. It's another thing to actually do the work and find the ways to scale these solutions. And finally, I think that as an educational tool, the powers of 10 as a mental model has a lot of potential for helping people understand how they are connected to the rest of the planet. And, you know, I could imagine some kind of a visualization, a poster in classrooms around the world that help, you know, put into context how we as communities and we as cultures, we as countries and language groups and so forth are all connected in with the global village, so to speak. So I think that's enough from me for now, and I'd like to open it up if there's any questions.
Mark, this is Tamara. I may have missed it in the noise, but I was wondering, can you describe a little bit more how you made the connection between the powers of 10 and the drawdown activities as they were described? I couldn't quite see how you made the connection for what fit into what power of 10.
Okay, that's a good question. So we do detail the methodology in our paper, and the preprint of the paper is available through Earth Access, and I'll put the link in the chat box in a second here.
Okay,
but basically, we looked at each of the 72 different strategies, and each of us individually made our estimate based on our own research and our own experience on where we thought the range would be for implementation. So as an example, rooftop solar can be deployed on a single house or up to like an apartment-sized building. And of course, you can have a whole city with rooftop solar, but in terms of the agency, we would look at a range from like an individual scale, P0, on up to a neighborhood scale of, say, P3 or 4. I don't have the numbers in front of me here. So each of us came up with a range, and then we had discussions to determine what we would agree to as kind of our consensus, what we would agree the range would be. And in most cases, we agreed, you know, very closely, and it was a very simple matter to say, well, here's why I think it should be P3 to P7, and then if everybody agreed, we would set it as P0 to P7, and in some cases we had to have more in-depth conversations to come up with that consensus. But then we took the median of that range as the optimization point. And of course, we use the median in a lot of scientific analysis of ecosystems and you know, all sorts of things, because it's generally regarded as the central tendency of a particular range. So each one of the solutions had its range and had its median, and then we organized the different solutions by sector and came up with some analysis of how each sector had a specific general range. And of course, this is based on Drawdown's global analysis. And not each of these solutions is going to work well in every part of the world. So for instance, rice cultivation is very geographic specific because there's only certain parts of the world where rice cultivation is practical. And but within that realm where it's practiced, the range will be from the individual farmer level on up to a scale that requires, government policies and support. So does that answer your question, Tamara?
Yeah, thank you very much. And one other point related to that, when you first put up your powers of 10, you listed corporations in the category of urban, sort of in that order of magnitude. But I would suggest that you also include a separate item called businesses, which can be much smaller. And
Right.
at that P4, P3 level, depending on the size of the business. And I think in addressing local problems, that I think you just should include businesses at that community level also.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I think that that's a very old slide when I was first trying to describe the different levels, and we don't use that phrase in the final paper, the paper that's in submission right now. But I think you're bringing up a very good point, because most businesses on the planet are micro businesses. There are a few people, often a family business of a few people. It's primarily in the Western world, although increasingly in Asia as well, where corporations are of a bigger scale of thousands of people. And of course, there's the few giant companies that are tens of thousands of people, or in a few cases, hundreds of thousands of people. But they're really the exception rather than the rule.
Mark, thank you so very much, and I hope everyone was able to get as much of that as I was, even though the audio was a little challenging. But do others have any questions or things that they want to raise with Mark now?
I just want to say, Mark, this is Anna, that it's I totally agree with you that it's such an interesting tool to think about education. We do a lot of community-based work, and seeing that that's the sweet spot is really, really helpful, with knowing, yes, you need everything else, but it's also empowering, right? Because you feel like at a community you can make a difference, or people feel more empowered to make a difference. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Hey, Mark, this is
think,
Abby. Oh,
go ahead, Abby. I think you're going to say something.
Well, I'll wait till you respond if you'd like.
Yeah, I think that something that I've been wrestling with is the fact that those of us, from the Western part of the world, really believe in community-based transformation, but there's other parts of the world where it's harder to do that for different reasons. Here in Hungary, I was just talking to a friend the other day who said this idea that communities are going to rally around climate action is very naive, because everybody's just still waiting for Big Daddy, so to speak, the government patriarchs to tell them what to do, and that it really, everything ultimately has to be done from the top down national level. So a lot of our approach, I think, is kind of idealized and perhaps in some way biased by our background from the West. That said, I think there's community-based efforts going on in many parts of the world, even here in Hungary.
Yeah, my comment, first of all, thank you. It's always really informative to me to just hear you go through this in the background on it. And I plugged in the link to the archive for people, so you don't have to worry about that, Mark. That's in the chat box.
Thank you.
No problem. I wanted to also sort of underscore, I think for educators and for the Clean Network, another lens on the value of this paper, which is really this impulse that is happening now with the time crunch that we're all feeling as we careen ahead globally. And that is, how this has, sort of picking up on your last point, Mark, how this has, and the paper documents this in various iterations of the paper, how the process to organize ourselves as humanity around addressing the climate threat moved from nation state to increasingly to the community level, even in the UNFCCC process and sort of related processes, especially when Christiana Figueres, kind of got a hold of the process and others that she was working with and opened it up so that there was, tribal input and community input that went into the Paris Agreement, but also because of the president we ended up with, the reaction to that generated a lot of activity that bubbled up from the business community and colleges and universities and the community level. Not that that wasn't already starting to happen, and the president's compact and so on had taken place long before that, but the paper documents this and puts it into context, and I think lays out a really important case for the need to, once again, we educators have been at this for a long time of ourselves as a community being at the table for these increasingly important strategies that address these very complex issues that we are across the globe grappling with. So I think the paper contributes a lens on that I think we hope, I'll speak, for the authors on this, will be something that educators and those looking to fund education programs can use to raise the importance of education along with technology and finance and top-down governmental processes. Policy is what I meant to say.
So we're about 6 minutes out. Do others have things that they want to put on the table for exploration with Mark?
Yeah, this is Patrick. I'll jump in here. Mark, thanks for your presentation. I'm looking forward to sharing some of your findings with my creative climate communication class. The students have been doing a lot of work on Drawdown, and I think this helps connect some dots. I was wondering, as you're thinking about these powers of 10, these levels of impact, did you guys think through, when you're working to have a large impact, do you think it's effective to choose a solution that addresses, say, the family or the group level in the hopes of reaching the broader community or impacts, or do you think that it's more impactful? Oh, what's that?
I'm sorry, I missed part of that.
Can you hear me there?
Yeah, you kept cutting in and out.
Well, I was wondering. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I was wondering if in the hope to reach the community or meta community level or the bigger levels, if you felt like it was effective to go about it by reaching family by family or group by group, if that gave a culminative impact to the larger scales, or if you felt like solutions needed to address the scale that they were appropriate for to have that impact. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand what you mean. It's going to depend on this particular strategy. So for instance, family planning and educating girls, which is, a big issue in especially the developing part of the world. It's not an issue here in Hungary, where they're basically trying to get people to have more kids because they're losing population because not enough babies are being born, and they're not keen on immigration here. But in the developing world, where birth rates are still very high, girls' education and family planning really need to be obviously supported at a higher level, ideally at a national level, but the implementation is going to be happening at a very grassroots level in terms of having those conversations with individual women and having them feel comfortable in being part of that conversation. So there has to be trust built up at a very sort of personal scale, which I think is where those personal networks really come into play. With something like mass transit, it's, you need a certain critical mass of people for mass transit to really be effective. You can have other strategies, ride sharing and so forth, perhaps to fill in the gap if you're smaller than that. But as we know from a lot of mass transit projects, you need enough people to make it economically viable and sustainable. So does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and I'm really thinking about it in terms of what I'm giving to students to consider impact with. Considering the effectiveness of reaching those smaller scales, I think it's good to consider the overall goal of the solution, and also to think about it in terms of numbers, how many people in those small scales you have to reach to then consider the solution expanded to the next scale.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we have to be opportunistic in a certain way of finding those early adopters and those networkers who can help make things happen fast, who have the personality and the drive to really spark things. One thing, since we're to the top of the hour, that I did want to mention and give a shout out to Abby again, because one of her big contributions to this paper was a case study on Thurston County, Washington, where they have started to use the powers of 10 approach in their planning for climate action. And there's a whole section of our paper. You won't see it in the original version that isn't available in preprint, but hopefully you'll see it soon in the journal Science when it gets published, if all goes well, because it's a fairly in-depth look at what's happened in Thurston County, which is at that sweet spot meta-community scale. The county itself is about 200 and something thousand people, and half of it is urban and half of it is rural. And there's a lot of diversity. There's several different school districts. It's the capital of the state is there. So there's a ripple effect that goes, what happens in Thurston County has a ripple effect through the whole state and beyond. So hopefully you all will have a chance to see that soon.
Mark, unfortunately for us, we have come to our time. I imagine it's quite late for you, but I just want to thank you personally for all the work you and the partners have been working on and carrying the torch and the big, bold vision that you've always focused on. So thank you for that. And it's wonderful to reconnect with you. I remember the first time I met you, and you're my first climate literacy partner. And that was a long time ago, 2005.
Indeed.
So we've come a long way in that period of time, and you just demonstrated another wave of potential and possibility and vision. So, and all your partners, I can't wait to dig into this paper. So, thank you for that, and I hope those who are listening stick through the audio. This was one of those important telecons. Not, it just stands apart because of such an interesting approach that we all want to struggle with scale. So I really appreciate you sharing your time with us. And Abby, thank you for being a partner with Mark. It's wonderful to see where you guys have gotten to.
Frank, this is Jen. I just wanted to mention that there is a Facebook group for ECOS that I have found helpful, just to throw that out there for communication and just staying connected. That I think, Mark, you probably started that, or someone did from your team. So just to point that out, I put it in the chat, the link.
Great. Thanks, Jen.
Sure.
And let's follow up very soon about some of the structures that we put in place that work for Clean and why that works for us, and see if that helps with how ECOS could grow. I'm very interested in both continuing to play an important role. So again, thank you all. I know we're a couple of minutes over, so let's stop there. Thank you again.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.